I'd like to start very simply with just the title. I wonder whether you could go some way to explaining what you mean by a post-continental philosophy.
I suppose it's back to basics. I'm not saying that continental philosophy is over. Far from it. I'd be out of a job for a start. But a slightly more noble reason is in what's not exactly a very original idea concerning the meaning of the word post, as in the postmodern. It does not indicate a passing, a demise, an annihilation, something that philosophy unfortunately suffered during the 20th century. Many people, of course, would like that to be the case, that the ideas and thoughts of a Derrida or a Heidegger are now past us. It's not that at all. It's rather indicates a shift, let's say, in continental philosophy. A shift in particular, as I thought at the beginning of writing the book, in particular in continental philosophy's relationship to science. That was, for me, a primary concern. Continental philosophy has had, at best, an ambivalent relationship to science. And a good deal of it, though this is a very complicated story, it has to be told with much more detail than I can give here, but a good deal of it coming down to the influence of Heidegger. Heidegger has a very important and complicated attitude towards science, as he also obviously does towards the history of philosophy and a certain kind of metaphysical philosophy. And he believes that, in a sense, there was a culmination of the metaphysical project, beginning with Plato and, in a sense, coming to a climax with Nietzsche, that brings that kind of project of that type of thinking to an end. And science takes over. Science, which is the desire to control, to enframe nature, being even, takes over and does so much better what philosophers like Plato and Descartes and Hegel have all been trying to do. And Heidegger says, therefore, after this type of metaphysical scientific project comes something else, what he calls the thinking of being. Because of that influence that has come through, especially French philosophy, via a certain kind of post-phenomenological project embodied by people like, of course, Jacques Derrida, but others as well, there has always been a focus on the relationship of continental philosophy with literature, with poetry, with writing of a certain kind, neglecting the fact that there was always in French thought and in other parts of continental thinking a very close relationship with science, such as the writings of Maurice Merleau-Ponty on Gestalt psychology or Gaston Bachelard on quantum mechanics. So that's always been there, but seemingly quite neglected. My book, in a sense, indicates that there is now, it seems, an exhaustion or exasperation with that idea that continental philosophy and science just don't make an analytic type of philosophy that does so well with science. That is so not true. And I've picked 4 fundamental thinkers who each, in their own way, approach science in a very sophisticated manner. Deleuze, for his philosophy of biology in particular. Michel for his philosophy of affectivity and embodied emotion. Francois Laruelle for his scientific epistemology, and Alain Badiou for his embrace of mathematics, as he puts it, as the important thought, the only thought of ontology. Mathematics is ontology, is Badiou's thesis. Now, these four philosophers I've chosen, as opposed to Merleau-Ponty or Bachelard, who I cited earlier, because in their own philosophical way, in a very French way, they try to think the relationship of philosophy to a kind of scientific thinking, or at least an embodied thinking. I should make that correction when it comes to Henri. They bring it to a limit, to an extreme, in various different ways, especially Henri and Badiou. Badiou's thesis that mathematics equals ontology is an extreme thesis, seemingly leaving no place left for philosophy to go. What does philosophy do if the study of being, of ontology, belongs to the mathematical sciences? So I'm interested in these extreme philosophers, pure philosophers, and that was the initial point of the book.
That's great. I wonder whether you could talk about where the project went from a kind of starting point, or building the raw kind of blocks of the book.
Well, it began with this thesis about science. And then it seemed to me that science or naturalism, the naturalistic project, wasn't enough. What was important was the fact that all four of these philosophers were philosophers of immanence. They felt, in their own way, that philosophy can only move forward if we get rid of those transcendent or transcendental, some people don't like to mix those terms, especially Kantians, but I don't care. They want to get rid of those overarching, outside, ethereal, determining categories, be it that of being, capital B, or language with capital L, especially within structuralism, or even philosophy with the capital P, according to Francois Laruelle, who replaces it with something he calls non-philosophy, which is a kind of materialistic, immanent philosophy. Each of them in their own way want to get rid of those transcendental categories, being, language, philosophy, in order to let thought carry on in an immanent way, in a close relationship with the natural sciences, or some kind of science anyway. And very much philosophies of the here and now in their own kind of way. But the problem was, and this book has, in a sense, its evolution was determined by a set of problems, things not going right according to the plan. The problem was, these philosophies do not make up a coherent body of work. They do not all think immanence in the same way. They do not all reject transcendence in the same way. Laruelle believes that what Badiou is doing and what Deleuze is doing is still a transcendental project. Badiou believes, infamously, that what Deleuze is doing is a transcendental project, and so it goes. Each of these philosophers of absolute immanence, Deleuze being the most famous, nonetheless believes that what the other is doing in their own project of absolute immanence still has the taint of transcendence, of language, of the ego, subjectivity, of some form of representation, transcendental representation, etc., etc. So there I was, trying to put together a program of what looks like a coherent shift, only to find that that coherence is tempered very strongly with contradiction and conflict. One thing they did all have, however, in common, alongside their desire to judge other philosophies of immanence as impure, was this. Namely, that in terms of their own work, none of them had the right or justification to judge other philosophies. Now, Deleuze, of course, is the most famous of the philosophies that does away with judgment, and yet, alongside doing away with dualism, and yet retains dualistic concepts and retains judgment, evaluates other philosophies as good or bad, useful or unuseful for life. So there is, in a sense, this problem of a philosophy of immanence, which in a sense has no outside, and yet judges an outside, judges another philosophy as right or wrong, or in some more complicated way, true or false, adequate or inadequate, etc. There are different vocabularies used, all of them usually trying to avoid falling in to the trap of representation, but nonetheless all of them still doing just that, representing the other philosophy as in some way true or false, terms that Badiou, Henri, Laruelle and Deleuze all supposedly have disavowed.
That's great. I wonder whether you could say something specifically about the diagrammatic in your book and the use of diagrams, which was obviously the first paper from AV1 that you gave at the Remapping Deleuze conference, but part of that's been integrated into your book, hasn't it? I wonder whether you could say something about the diagrammatic.
Well, the next discovery, if you want to put it that way, that alongside the fact that these philosophies of immanence judge the other philosophies of immanence as still transcendent, but should not do so, the one other thing I discovered that they have in common actually concerns discourse. Namely, they all, in one form or another, turn to, or have turned to, a new kind of discourse, a new kind of philosophical expression in their own works. What that is the philosophical drawing or diagram. Be it Badiou in his famous use of set theory, but more importantly now category theory in the Logique du Monde, which is a sequel to Being an Event, which uses diagrams very importantly. Or, of course, Deleuze, who uses diagrams throughout his works, most famously in A Thousand Plateaus and in The Fold, and also, of course, Deleuze, who has a theory of the diagram. The diagram is central to his thinking. And along that, Laruelle, who in his early work on non-philosophy used Ravaisin's theories of drawing as a kind of way of producing a figurative metaphysics, a type of drawn philosophy that would somehow or another get away from transcendental categories again. And finally, Michel Henri, who, though he seems at times a kind of ethereal thinker, nonetheless brings his philosophy of affectivity back down to earth with a bang, using the abstract graphic art of Wassily Kandinsky. Kandinsky for him is a kind of drawing of philosophy, a drawing of affectivity, the key concept for Henri. So here it was that these four philosophies of pure immanence, throwing mud at each other as somehow being impure, and not being allowed to do so in terms of their own thought, they did have one way in which they could speak to each other, and speak to each other on a plain level field and legitimately. That was in terms of their use of diagrams and drawing. So the book itself basically has this final chapter which attempts to slowly replace words with diagrams to get these philosophies into some kind of dialogue through their use of the diagram and drawing. And whether that's successful or not, I'll leave to the reader to judge. But what I think is important here is that we should not fetishize the diagram, though all philosophers of this ilk use it. It's not some sort of new category of truth. The thing about the diagram in particular that's of interest for these thinkers, although I think Deleuze is the one who stands out here, because he has such an explicit theory of the diagram. And the thing that's really interesting is that the diagram is a sort of in-between form, something which is always perpetually in between a pure picture and some kind of text. The diagram is something that is both shown and something that is also read. You look at it and you also read it. It's something in between script and vision. And, even more importantly, all these philosophers at one point or another valorize movement and change and process in their work. And I think the diagram is that type of moving form, literally a diagram, the moving form, that perpetually in a sense, redraws itself. One must think of the diagram as a dynamic type of philosophical discourse. And so therefore what a diagram must be it be abstract, must it be geometric, can it be slightly more textured, more painterly, and those are often, or must, I think, not just often, must be remaining debatable, moot questions. The diagram very much can become anything. And Deleuze describes Bacon's paintings, for instance, as diagrammatic, even in as much as they don't in any way look like the slightly more diagrammatic, obviously diagrammatic paintings of a Kandinsky. There is a kind of diagram there. And he calls that a virtual diagram, and I would not be so happy with the use of the term virtual. But I think what Deleuze has put his finger on is the possibility of thinking of the diagram, of this in-between form, as in a sense a placeholder that must be replaced with or fleshed out differently depending on the context. Film, for instance, could be the diagram, or vice versa, the diagram could be filmic, depending on the context, depending on, if you like, the viewing event, the viewing context, the reader, the audience, what is being spoken of, and so on.
Thanks, John. I wonder whether you could say something more specifically about your use of Deleuze in this book. He features very heavily at the beginning of the book, and I wonder whether you could just say something about his importance at the beginning of this book to start to map the way these philosophers of immanence work together.
Yes, good question, good final question. Why Deleuze? Why that special place for Deleuze at the start of the book? As I say somewhere else, another title for the book might well have been not Post-Continental Philosophy, an outline, but After Deleuze, or what comes, or who comes after Deleuze. Deleuze really does represent a pivotal moment in continental philosophy, both because of what he points towards, this closer relationship to science, for instance, in his writings on biology, physics, and so on, but also because of what he still retains from the continental tradition, a close alliance with a writerly project, not just in his own style, philosophical expression, but also in the way in which he brings his philosophy of science, of the sciences, together with a philosophy of the humanities and of the arts, fine art, literature, and so on. And that makes him slightly ambivalent character. That's one thing. But the other thing is more like a philosophical issue. There are many, many Deleuzes. I talk of only two in this book. There are many more. This is reflected, obviously enough, in one respect, by the commentary, the secondary literature on Deleuze. You have, on the one hand, those writers like Manuel Delanda and Brian Massumi, who take the Deleuze who is more naturalistic, closer to the sciences, uses empirical evidence to back up arguments, but also the Deleuze of embodiment, of the affect, of movement, as Massumi talks of in great depth. That Deleuze is crucial, as opposed to the Deleuze who's more abstract, more of a mathematical thinker, and therefore not so naturalistic in his sciences or scientific predilections, but more Platonist, dare I say it. The Deleuze who thinks of the virtual, the Deleuze who thinks of ion, those great abstractions. That kind of Deleuze, the one that, for instance, Badiou comments on, and wrongly then tries to build up, I think, into the picture of the whole or essential Deleuze, that Deleuze goes in quite a different direction than the one of embodiment and sensation. It is the Deleuze of a certain kind of logical abstract thought, of the logic of sense, of difference and repetition, versus the Deleuze of A Thousand Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus. You might say it's the pure Deleuze versus the collaborative Deleuze. I wouldn't go that far either myself. But certainly That there are different types of commentaries and commentators on Deleuze emphasizing different dimensions of his thought is no coincidence. They're not making this up. I think in Deleuze there are lots of really fertile, complex potentials going in different directions. And in a way, I use Deleuze first because what happens with Badiou and Henri later in the book represents what can be done with Deleuze if you distill only one side of his thought down to some kind of pure essence. The Deleuze of the abstract idea, the Deleuze of the actual affect. And these pure essences, as is my general view, just don't work. They don't work in as much as they are pure and puritanical. They simply don't work. They need each other. And I think Henri, some of the problems with Henri's philosophy of pure effectivity, just as with Badiou's, where she equates ontology with mathematics, I don't think they work in and of themselves. They are not self-sufficient thought. There is a need for something more abstract and mathematical in Henri. There is a need for something more embodied and affective in Badiou. Now Badiou, in his Logique du Monde, is pushing in that direction, a much more embodied phenomenological philosophy going on there, and I address that in the book. And in a sense, they both come out of Deleuze, but the insufficiencies of their pure thought of mathematical immanence versus affective immanence pushes them back together again. And I, in a sense, argue this point as much through philosophical deduction, so to speak, as through their own use of diagrams and the connection they have with philosophical drawing that I was talking about earlier. That's why the subtitle of Post-Continental Philosophy is an outline. It outlines, not just in a sketch briefy way, a possible future for continental philosophy, but it physically outlines in its pages, in drawn diagrammatic form, the relationship between Badiou and Henri as symbolic of diverging aspects out of the warring tendencies within Deleuze that then come back together. They can also be brought back together, these warring tendencies in Deleuze, via Laruelle. Laruelle is importantly influenced by Deleuze, but brings in other things as well. And I look at that, of course, in the book. But the main thing about Deleuze, I think, is that I find him a fascinating figure because of that complex, rich texture of his thought that cannot be hammered into any smooth shape, such as to show that this is the Deleuze. This is the essential Deleuze. There are many types of Deleuze, and that complication, that multiplicity of his thought is what makes it fertile and interesting and worth returning to time and time again.